Carbon offset project is something that is supposedly about trying to help address the problem of global climate change. And this is being caused by the increase in the atmosphere, in the air of certain gases, carbon-based gases like carbon dioxide. Some of these occur naturally, but because of the burning of things like petrol and oil, wood and coal, charcoal, these all release a gas called carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. This has been increasing, and this gas serves to trap heat inside the Earth's atmosphere. This problem is causing changes in the weather and the climate around the world, including, for example, in northern Kenya, where droughts are becoming more frequent and more severe, and in other parts of the world, very damaging storms and floods are happening more frequently as well. So for nearly 30 years, governments around the world have been pledging to try and do something about this problem, because it will get much worse in the future if nothing is done about it, by reducing the amount of carbon that is being put into the atmosphere by burning fossil fuels mostly. However, there are other ideas about this, because this presents a big threat, a big challenge to companies like oil companies, airlines, and so on, that produce a lot of this pollution. It can be very expensive for them to actually cut their emissions of these kinds of carbon-based gases. So instead of them actually reducing their own pollution, the idea is that they pay someone else somewhere to reduce their carbon emissions, or to actually actively capture that carbon and bring it back out of the atmosphere, whilst the oil companies or the airlines or whoever it is carry on producing their own pollution. So this is what an offset scheme is about. It's about a polluting company paying someone else to supposedly reduce these emissions of global greenhouse gases, or to remove those existing greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere for an equivalent amount, supposedly, of the pollution that these big companies are causing. Since 2013, NRT has been running one of these supposed carbon offset projects. And the idea behind this is that by changing the grazing patterns of cows, camels, goats, and so on, it's possible to cause more grasses and other vegetation to grow in the areas of 13 of the community conservancies, over about 2 million hectares, areas which NRT claims have been overgrazed in the past because of traditional pastoralism. So the idea is that by changing these patterns onto what they called planned rotational grazing, where they take control of a family's animals and then move them around according to some kind of careful plan, they say, they create more vegetation, and this brings down more of this carbon out of the atmosphere, and they say that it will be stored permanently in the soil underneath the lands of these conservancies. And this is a very big project that they've been selling. They've created some 4 million carbon credits, like roughly 4 million tons of carbon they claim has been captured through this process. And they've been selling those carbon credits, as they're called, to big companies, including Netflix and Meta, to enable those companies to claim that they're becoming carbon neutral. The very basis of this project is that NRT claims that the traditional forms of grazing have been causing degradation of the soil. They've been overgrazing, and this has been causing reductions in the amount of carbon that's stored there in the soils in which these, the grasses and so on in the conservancies are growing. So, in order to introduce what NRT calls this new planned rotational grazing, they have to take control, essentially, of everybody's animals, and they have to put them under the control of NRT-employed grazing managers that move the cattle around, very carefully from place to place, week by week and month by month. And that they claim helps the vegetation regenerate and more carbon to be stored in the soil. But that means that the traditional management by families and governed under the traditional grazing regimes cannot operate anymore. So this would potentially cause a huge change in the way that people in northern Kenya, inside these NRT conservancies, are able to manage their own cattle, or not be able to manage their own cattle. One of the big concerns, particularly big concern, is that under this project, this NRT carbon project, all cattle are supposed to stay inside the conservancies. They're not allowed to go out into other areas. And it's not being enforced very much, but it could be enforced at some point. And this would obviously have a major impact if it prevented cattle being moved to areas during drought where there is still vegetation available, maybe south to Mount Kenya, for example. So NRT doesn't want that happening anymore, basically, and that could be extremely dangerous if the traditional movement, migration of livestock herds is prevented. We investigated exactly how this project appears to be working, and what we found is it doesn't seem that NRT is actually carrying out a lot of what it claims to be doing, and this so-called planned rotational grazing. I mean, it's either very little different from what was happening in the past, or it's not really happening at all. And there isn't any real kind of evidence, any solid evidence that the project is doing what it says in terms of causing more vegetation to grow or storing more carbon in the soil. So the carbon credits that are being created from this project appear to be worthless in terms of representing any improvement for climate change. So the short answer is, it appears as if the project is actually doing nothing towards climate change. But what it's doing, of course, is allowing the companies who are buying those carbon credits to claim that they're becoming carbon neutral and to not take action to reduce their own emissions. So in that sense, you could say it's actually making climate change worse. And that, again, is a serious problem when we see the effects of this increasing climate change in places like northern Kenya very severely, with drought and lack of rainfall becoming progressively worse and more intense as the years progress. This carbon credit project can produce a lot of money, basically, because it can sell over the next 20, 30 years or so, tens of millions of these carbon credits, and each of them can go for maybe $7, $10, even $20 each, something like that. So we're talking about potentially hundreds of millions of dollars being generated by this project, and probably something in the region of $40 million worth of credits has already been sold by Northern Rangelands Trust. And so this can potentially generate money for the communities and the conservancies, let's say, that are originally producing these carbon credits, because each conservancy produces a proportion of the total amount being sold by the project. Unfortunately, though, the way that the project has been set up, most of the credits, or most of the profit from the credits, let's say, is going to, well, firstly, a US-based marketing organization. They're getting 20 or 30% of all of the proceeds from the sale of these credits. NRT itself is taking something like another 20% or so. It kind of varies a bit depending on how much the first lot get. And then the rest of it is notionally divided up amongst the 13 participating conservancies. But of that portion, which is about a half of it or thereabouts, most of it then actually is how it gets spent exactly is determined again by NRT. So the conservancies have to apply to NRT to get some money back from the project from the sale of the carbon credits that they are creating. Only a very, very small percentage, it's about 1% or so, 1.5%, of the total of the benefit of these credits is being distributed to each of the 13 conservancies automatically. So it's a very small percentage, basically, which is going directly to the conservancies. So this so-called Northern Kenya grasslands project being run by NRT is just one of many, many hundreds that are happening around the world. And I've looked into a number of these in the past, and there are similar problems actually happening with many of them. People are kind of losing their lands, they're losing their livelihoods, they're being cheated out of a certain amount of benefits often, and in many cases, the project isn't actually having any beneficial impact for the climate at all. So again, the carbon credits that are being sold from it, as seems to be the case with NRTs, are essentially worthless. And very worryingly, actually, we see these kinds of projects expanding very, very quickly in many countries, including Kenya, where there are several other similar kinds of projects in the process of being set up, like NRT's project. The reason the term blood carbon is used is because potentially in the future, the only way that these kinds of projects can be enforced is through armed control. NRT's rangers have already been implicated in some very serious human rights abuses, and the fear is that these could intensify as NRT is forced to kind of intervene more kind of thoroughly, if in a sense, in the way that grazing is carried out. They already stop people and they confiscate animals if they're moving outside the conservancies. One could see that these kinds of problems could become much, much worse. And we're aware that the amount of conflict that's been happening has been increasing as the number of weapons in the area, and often those of NRT's rangers has also been increasing. So this is why this project, I think, has the potential to cause a lot more conflict and in the area of the conservancies, and that is, of course, extremely worrying. What we've heard from councils of elders in the project area is that the project is actually in some ways undermining what they see as being the most important things to be happening, and particularly the registration of land for the communities under the Community Land Act. And there's an ongoing court case about that, for example, and resolution of that and securing the land for the communities should be a basis for a future for that area. If that happens and the communities have absolute rights to it and absolute control over it, then perhaps they can consider if they want to be involved in a carbon offset project. At the moment, because there isn't that security of ownership of the land, it's essentially NRT very much dictating the terms of how this project runs, and the terms of how that run is actually quite disadvantageous to local communities. How much benefit the communities are getting from this project, I think, can also be questioned. I think the conservancy boards, which have signed these agreements with NRT to sell these carbon credits from each of the conservancies, I think they should be questioned about how much money is actually coming from this. Is this a fair arrangement? How much money is NRT actually getting overall from these projects? Well, that's hard to know because NRT never publishes its accounts. So we don't know exactly how much these carbon credits are being sold for, how much is coming to NRT, and then how much should be being distributed to the conservancies. So those, I think, are all perfectly legitimate questions for communities to be asking.